Hello everybody, this is Dr. Beltran speaking here. I'm a physician. I specialize within the field of internal medicine and dermatology. I'm originally from South America, Brazil. That's where I work as a physician. I'm also a research scientist in the United States and also a vitamin D expert. The subject for today is going to be on the mechanisms of autoimmunity. I will be explaining on how autoimmunity takes place and what are the different contributing factors that can lead to autoimmunity. I'm also the author of the LGS protocol, which is the leaky gut syndrome protocol. It's a protocol that I utilize to be able to treat patients who do have autoimmune diseases. I have treated more than 2,500 patients so far, and I have been doing this since the year of 2015. So to give continuation to my presentation, I would like to go ahead and welcome you. I hope that this video is very illustrative and also might bring in some light into many doubts and questions that you guys might have. So to begin with, before we dive into what autoimmunity, the mechanisms of what autoimmunity is, first let's define what an autoimmune disease is. So as we know, an autoimmune disease is a condition in where your immune system starts attacking your own cells or different tissues, different organ systems by the production of antibodies, autoantibodies. So that's what defines an autoimmune disease. It's basically your immune system is attacking itself, and it's doing it through different mechanisms, okay? So what leads to this is what we need to try to understand. And it's important to recognize that there are a series of barriers and levels that we have to understand and in order to be able to get to the point in the actual presentation, the actual clinical presentation of an autoimmune disease, which can not only just manifest clinically, but also be determined by laboratory as well. So there are a series of levels, and barriers that the immune system must overcome in order for autoimmunity to actually set in and take place. But I would say that 80% of most patients or even more, perhaps even 90% of my patients who do have autoimmune disease basically have a condition known as dysbiosis at the level of the gut. Now, this dysbiosis does not necessarily need to be coming from the gastrointestinal tract. Let us not forget that we also have bacteria, good bacteria or bad bacteria that lives in our skin. It can also be found in our respiratory tract. It can be found in our genital urinary tract. It can be found in many different organs, in many different places, in the mouth, in the cavities. I mean, we have bacteria all over our body, right? So if I'm not mistaken, we have more than 39.7 trillion bacteria just found in our gastrointestinal tract. So we're actually more bacteria than cells. Isn't that ironic, right? So we live in symbiosis with these bacteria, and when we do not have this symbiosis, this leads to a condition known as dysbiosis, okay? So dysbiosis basically is the imbalance of bad bacteria over good bacteria, okay? And it can happen in any organ system. But mainly, I will be addressing to this today, at least, is to the gastrointestinal tract, all right? So within the different contributing factors, I would say that the first major important contributing factor is our diet. I mean, the westernized diet and diets in many other countries around the world induce the presence of autoimmunity just by the fact that we're just introducing things that are very pro-inflammatory at the level of our gastrointestinal tract, which leads also to dysbiosis. Now, one of the foods that I always mention that can actually cause such things are, for instance, foods that have gluten. Gluten is a lectin. It is a very pro-inflammatory lectin. It is made up of prolamins such as gliadin and glutenin. Gliadin, for instance, once it gets absorbed by the epithelium that's found at the gastrointestinal tract, this epithelium is represented by a group of cells known as enterocytes. These enterocytes, when they absorb gliadin, which is a molecule that's within the molecular structure of gluten, this gliadin gets absorbed by these enterocytes, and they upregulate a molecule known as zonulin. Now, zonulin is going to act upon a protein that helps bind these cells known as tight junctions. Now, when these tight junctions, all of a sudden now get unbound, you're just increasing now the porosity or increasing the permeability of things that are found within the gastrointestinal tract, and now can actually make it through and interact with your immune system. Now, talking about your immune system, let's not forget that 80% of the immune system is found in the gastrointestinal tract. There's a reason why it's there, because we just need to filter, make sure that, certain things do not get in, right? And unfortunately, gliadin is one of the mechanisms by which you all of a sudden increase permeability and leads to a condition known as leaky gut syndrome. And we'll talk a little bit about that now, okay? So leaky gut syndrome is basically when there is an increase in the permeability of the gastrointestinal tract, allowing foreign proteins that might be coming from the diet, and also, proteins and toxins that are actually found are coming from our microbiome. Okay, and they make it in, and they make their way in and interact with our immune system, which basically sometimes overreacts our immune system. I mean, it surpasses our immunologic tolerance, right? And not only gluten can do this, but this can also be found in other foods, such as dairy. Dairy has another lectin known as casein. Casein is a lectin that is very pro-inflammatory. It's even been studied and associated with some forms of other forms of different types of cancer, such as prostate cancer, breast cancer. We also have lectins in certain foods known as our nightshades. Nightshades are, for instance, tomatoes are very rich in lectins. Lentils and beans. Black beans, brown beans. All of these are nightshades, green peppers, eggplants. There's a very large list of foods that are very rich in lectins, which can also cause a lot of inflammation of the gut. Okay, and obviously, finally, we also have sugars, carbs. If we have an excess amount of sugar that's going into our body, that's going to lead to problems in regards to dysbiosis, because we know that these bacteria that we have in our gut use sugars as a source of food and a source of energy, which can eventually cause an overpopulation of bad bacteria over good bacteria, leading to a known condition known once again as dysbiosis. And dysbiosis can be classified as mild, moderate, or severe, and according to the degree of the dysbiosis, we'll also be able to see degree of clinical manifestations that correspond to that type of dysbiosis. Okay, so now going back to what I was saying in regards to dysbiosis, it is the port of entry, one of the major contributors by which we end up developing leaky gut syndrome. You see, because these bacteria, something that's not only just limited to bacteria, by the way, it also can be caused by different other things that's also found in our gastrointestinal tract. We do not only have bacteria, we also have viruses, we have funguses, we also have parasites. So depending on what organism we're talking about, you can develop a form of autoimmunity. Okay, so diet is a major contributor there. Okay, and lectins are part of the problem. Now, once again, chronic infections can be also the major contributor to autoimmunity. Sometimes you have a underlying genetic predispositions. For instance, I have some patients who have mast cell activation syndrome, and they have a history of Lyme's disease, or dysbiosis, or some form of bacteria, chronic infection, or even viral infections, such as Epstein-Barr virus, that has been ongoing there for years and years, and end up developing an autoimmune disease known as multiple sclerosis, or patients who have, infections, bacterial infections, fungal infections, that end up developing, such as candida, end up developing psoriasis. So if you have an ongoing chronic infection, yes, this can definitely become a source of a autoimmune disease. Okay, so bacterial, viral, fungal, parasitic, all of these infections can lead to autoimmunity. Okay, and the gastrointestinal barrier is the first step in which this can actually be the trigger for it becoming to that. Okay, now obesity, that's another one. That's a big one right there. You see, obesity. I mean, more than 50% of the population in the United States and also in Brazil is overweight. You see, and if we dive into there's a lot of problems in regards to insulin resistance, and metabolic syndrome, which can actually eventually lead to other problems such as cancer. But obesity is another major contributor here, and it causes a chronic inflammatory state. There's insulin resistance as well, which modifies in the way how our immune system also behaves. Okay, and at the same time, here's what I'm going to be talking about vitamin D in a little bit, because people who are obese are more prone to being vitamin D deficient, because let us not forget that vitamin D, which is, by the way, vitamin D is a hormone. It is not a vitamin. We make it when we expose ourselves to the sun. Vitamin D is the most potent hormone and immune modulator in the body. And if you are obese, you are more prone to becoming vitamin D deficient, okay? And vitamin D should not be taken monthly wise or every 15 days. On the contrary, it needs to be taken on a daily basis. And the reason why is this is because the half-life of vitamin D3, the one that you buy at the store, is a half-life of 24 hours. And the one that gets stored in the body, known as calcidiol or 25-hydroxyvitamin D, has a half-life of 2 to 3 weeks. And finally, the actual hormone itself, known as calcitrol, has a half-life of only 2 to 3 hours. Okay, so vitamin D needs to be taken daily. Okay, I'm done with that. I've said that. So If you have any questions in regards to vitamin D, it needs to be taken daily. It should not be taken every 2 weeks or once a week or once a month. It has to be taken every single day, okay? In order to have adequate amounts of vitamin D3 levels. So if you are obese, if you have obesity, if you have issues in losing weight, you might have metabolic syndrome, you might have insulin resistance, and you most definitely probably have vitamin D deficiency. And if you have vitamin D deficiency, you're going to be having problems with your immune system, because the immune system is governed thanks to vitamin D, okay? And the reason why I say this is because every single cell in our body, there isn't any cell in our body that does not have vitamin D receptors, okay? And I'm going to dig into that in just a little bit, okay? So, as I mentioned, dysbiosis, the imbalance of our microbiome, of our microflora that we have in our intestinal tract, can eventually lead to what we know as the loss of our immune tolerance. And when we have a loss of our immune tolerance, we end up developing what we might call molecular mimicry. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So here is something that is very important to recognize. And the reason why many individuals not only have dysbiosis is because they end up developing what we call biofilms. Biofilms are a real big problem, especially in patients who have very bad degree of dysbiosis. Biofilms is a collective group of these bacteria that actually bind up together, creating a smesh, like a mush of, like this green slime, I guess you could call it, or something like that, that actually it's a matrix that creates like a very large barrier where antibiotics can barely touch the surface on these bacteria or these microorganisms, because they communicate with each other and they say, hey, if we don't help each other and these antibiotics start to kick in, we're going to die. So one of the mechanisms of defense is that these bacteria, they end up, helping each other, creating this matrix of certain proteins, and which basically, creates a specific, like a type of shield that does not allow for antibiotics or, antimicrobials to be able to eliminate or eradicate these bad bacteria. And these are what we call biofilms, and they're always present and in many different parts of our body, okay? These biofilms can be also not found only in our gastrointestinal tract, but sometimes you can even find them over your skin. And this is why sometimes, these patients who have very large ulcers or lesions on their feet or on their legs, and they're diabetic, and it's because they have this bacteria that has developed a very, very resistant biofilm against antibiotics. So this is a very big issue. There are certain antibiotics that don't even touch the surface, and these biofilms are highly present, especially in hospital in patients, because if you get an intra-hospital infection, oh boy, that's going to be a bacteria that's multi-resistant and probably are bacteria that are prone to making biofilms. So this is why it's very important to sometimes use what we call biofilm disruptors. Sometimes you need to use not only just traditional antibiotics, but you need to actually give herbal antibiotics that our body, that we're not used to prescribing, as physicians. Very few physicians are familiar with prescribing berberine, licorice, oregano oil, and golden seal, what sort, because this is nothing that was actually taught in medical school. But if you do look into the literature, you'll see that there is an abundance of of information out there in regards to all of these natural herbal antibiotics that they even work better than normal antibiotics. And the reason why is because they're not used as much. So there's not such a very large resistance that develops from the use of these herbal antibiotics. Okay, and it is these biofilms that if you do have a biofilm and it's ongoing and it's been there for years and years and years, that's probably one of the reasons you might actually have a condition known as psoriasis, or you actually might have a condition known as, hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's disease, or multiple sclerosis, or vitiligo. I mean, it could be anything, but it's that biofilm that is causing the problem, you see. And these biofilms are very hard to treat sometimes. Sometimes you need a couple of rounds of antibiotics or herbal antibiotics to be able to eradicate the infection, because it's an infection. At the end of the day, that's what it is, And there are ways of how we can go about by doing that. Okay, so I use a lot of herbal antibiotics and sometimes I might even combine them with some known antibiotics that we do have in the pharmaceutical industry. Okay. Having that said, so biofilms are a very big problem. If the patient has a specific biofilm, a group of bad bacteria there that are causing this big biofilm that's causing so much inflammation, ongoing leaky gut syndrome, that's one of the things you need to address. So it's addressing the diet, addressing any chronic infection, addressing any biofilm, and obviously, if the patient's obese, he needs to be on a diet that's going to make him lower, his body mass index. Okay. And so going now to what we know as genetic single nucleotide polymorphisms, or also mutations. This is something that I really pay a lot of attention to. And the reason why is because polymorphisms are very common, especially vitamin D polymorphisms, genes that are governed, the genes that govern vitamin D metabolisms. I'm not going to be going into detail because if I do that, this is going to be a very long video, But yes, I studied the genes that govern vitamin D metabolisms, so the way how it's made, the way it's transported, the way how it's converted. Every metabolite has a specific gene that upregulates specific enzymes, and if you have genetic polymorphisms, these needs to be compensated. And this is where the Coimbra protocol, or the high dose vitamin D protocol, whatever you want to call it, which I have implemented in my leaky gut syndrome. This is why I've dedicated many years of studying vitamin D, and I utilize it as one of my main, not only one of them, but one of the many major components in treating autoimmunity, is because vitamin D is actually a hormone, and it governs the way how our immune system plays, okay? Now, the requirements of vitamin D differ from one person to another. And one of the reasons is why, because it can be multifactorial. It can be a problem related to obesity. As I said, vitamin D is liposoluble. So you might, if you're an obese person, you're going to need more vitamin D, okay? You might have a single nucleotide polymorphisms in combination also too. So you're going to have to lose weight and also increase vitamin D to be able to compensate that genetic polymorphism and also break that vitamin D resistance, okay? So going into briefly I'm going to talk about this vitamin D resistance to get this concept out of the way and move forward and talk a little bit about the methylation cycle in just a little bit. But what happens is that if you're born with a single nucleotide polymorphisms of a specific gene or multiple genes of vitamin D metabolism, you're going to have problems in the making and the production of adequate amounts of vitamin D, okay? So some of us are blessed and we have good vitamin D genes. We just require the minimum to be able to make our immune system work perfectly well, or at least work within what we consider normal, all right? Now, unfortunately, some of us, and many of us, and at least 80 to 90% of my patients that I see in my consultation room, unfortunately have, vitamin D polymorphisms. And this means that in order for you to be able to make adequate amounts of vitamin D in your body, you need much higher doses of vitamin D, okay? And this dose may vary from one individual to another. And this is the reason why anybody who is going to be doing high dose vitamin D therapy needs to have a physician on board that understands and knows how to interpret laboratory results. Because one of the biomarkers that we use to see if we're actually giving adequate amounts of vitamin D to that patient is looking at its antagonist, which is the parathyroid hormone, okay? Now, this is not the best indicator because, at least in the Coimbra protocol, one of the things that we try to do is we try to inhibit PTH as much as possible and elevate vitamin D levels in the blood as much as possible as well, all right? And two of those metabolites that we usually measure, that at least I always measure, is always measuring 25-hydroxyvitamin D and 1,25-D-hydroxyvitamin D. So when I see those two, and I see that there is a very big disproportion in regards to conversion from one metabolite to the other, let's say that this one over here is calcifidiol, or 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and this one over here is 1,25-D-hydroxyvitamin D, and we see that we need a lot more of this metabolite in order to make this metabolite, which is the actual hormone. This guy over here, calcitriol, 125-hydroxyvitamin D is the actual hormone. If this guy is barely reaching, normal levels here, and this guy needs to be way up high over here in order. This shows you laboratory-wise that this patient, without even having to do genetic testing, probably has a genetic polymorphism that is affecting genes that convert one metabolite to the other. Okay, so this is why it's important to do genetic testing. This is where you can find it. Now, not only that, but sometimes in many cases, going out a little bit down from vitamin D. And sometimes, in many cases, the patient might not only just have vitamin D polymorphisms, but they might actually have, polymorphisms that affect other vitamins. You can have polymorphisms that affect vitamin B9, vitamin B12. Vitamin A, magnesium, certain polymorphisms that can actually are responsible in the way how certain minerals take place in our body. Now, vitamin D, in order for it to be able to be activated, requires magnesium. It's a very important cofactor. And some people are born with genetic polymorphisms in genes that govern magnesium metabolism. So these people actually require higher doses of magnesium, higher doses of vitamin B12, higher doses of vitamin B9, and depending on what they, and also vitamin A. Vitamin A is also a cofactor for vitamin D activation, And, this is something that is very, very important. I will get back to this. I'll just briefly mention it right now. Every single cell in your body has vitamin D receptors. There isn't a cell in your body that does not have vitamin D receptors. And in order for that cell to be able to upregulate what we know as transcription, and transcription upregulate the production of certain enzymes or proteins or whatever, they need to activate the vitamin D receptor, okay? Now, there are certain things that can actually block these receptors, and I'll talk about that in a minute, okay? So, anything that affects the methylation cycle, where vitamin B12, B9, B6 participates, and also vitamin D, these all participate at the level of the methylation cycle. Methylation cycle is so important at the level of the cell, is that it actually upregulates two major components. One is that it's going to upregulate the production, the genome sequencing, and there's another part that's going to be responsible for the epigenomic sequencing. So it regulates two very important routes. One is DNA production, and the other one is epigenome. So if we have genetic polymorphisms that affect genes such as MTHFR or MTT, or genes that are governed by the vitamin B12 known as methylfolate or methylcobalamin, and these genes over here that I just mentioned, all of these genes, if they have polymorphisms, they need to be compensated in association with also vitamin D as well, okay? Because many patients who do have genetic polymorphisms of their vitamin D genes also have problems with their methylation cycle, with the genes that are involved in the methylation cycle. You would be surprised how many individuals have polymorphisms in regards to the MTHFR gene. I would say around 30-40% of the population in general, okay? So heading forth, it's important to actually compensate these cycles, okay? Now this is a very important subject too, because many of us, unfortunately are getting bombarded on a daily basis, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go back to bed to sleep, you are getting bombarded with toxins, heavy metals, that are found in tap water, that are found in foods. Just to give you an idea, let's say you're drinking water and it's in a plastic water bottle, right? We know that the plastic, has certain chemicals that if you leave, for instance, and I've done this in the past, I'll admit it, I have done this in the past. I don't do it anymore, but there were times, that I forgot to take up my water bottle and I left it in the car, and then, it was, nice and sunny and hot, and the car itself, once it's out in the sun, the temperature really rises up there, and it gets to a point where the plastic that you have in that water bottle starts, releasing certain chemicals that are actually toxins and carcinogens into that water. And so whenever you get that water and you drink it, you're actually putting into yourself heavy, toxins and chemicals that are actually very carcinogenic. Okay, so we're getting exposed to these things on a daily basis. Also heavy metals. There are so many things in that you can find in tap water, or in the way how you cook your food. In South America, one of the things that we always see is that a lot of people get a lot of aluminum toxicity, because the way how their food is cooked, they use these pans, they're made out of aluminum, and they've been cooking their foods there for years because they last so long. So you can have aluminum toxicity, you can have lead toxicity, you can have copper toxicity, you can have arsenic toxicity. You name it. There's so many forms of toxicity. You can have toxicity through, halogens as well. Fluoride toxicity. Every day that when you brush your teeth with toothpaste, you're brushing your teeth with, fluoride. Fluoride is a very, it's very toxic because it gets easily absorbed into your body, and it competes. For instance, I'll just give you an example. Fluoride is a halogen that competes for iodine. Okay, so this can actually lead to a condition known as hypothyroidism, because instead of having that iodine molecule in your iodine hormones, such as T3 and T4, you now have a fluoride in place where an iodine is supposed to be. It might actually, when you measure the hormone, you'll be measuring the levels, and it might your T3 or your T4 might actually be within normal laboratory reference, but that molecule is not an active molecule because the chemical structure, the molecular structure, has replaced an iodine molecule with a fluoride molecule. So then you ask yourselves, why is it that these patients have, symptoms and, their labs are apparently normal, okay? So yes, toxins, heavy metals, chemicals, all of these things do have a place in autoimmunity, okay? And implants, this is another subject that's very, very common. I've seen patients who have autoimmunity, who have a specific autoimmune disease, and they might have been put, implants, breast implants, breast augmentation, or sometimes you might even have, dental implants, or you might have other forms of implants that might be placed in different parts of your body, which are foreign. Let's not forget, these are foreign objects that are being put inside of your body, and your immune system reacts to foreign objects, okay? And this is one of the mechanisms by which, you can actually develop an autoimmune disease, okay? So keep on going. Now I'm going to a really hot topic here. It's about vaccines. Vaccines have been proven. It has been described in the medical literature, where you can actually end up developing an autoimmune disease. Here we have, vaccines such as for HPV vaccines, influenza vaccines, messenger RNA vaccines. I don't even want to get into that topic because we already know a lot about this, okay? But yes, vaccines can induce autoimmunity, okay? And ongoing stress. Oh boy, if you have a lifestyle that's, full of stress, if you have, emotional stress, if you have spiritual stress, if you have, financial stress, if you have all these stressing factors that are affecting your daily life, if someone died, someone passed away, if you have someone that has, you have marital problems, if you have financial problems, if you have, self-esteem problems, anything that can cause ongoing stress in your life literally is like the entry for an autoimmune disease. And 99% of all my patients who consult with me, that's one of the first things I've actually asked them, if something tragic or something important or something bad happened in their lives that can actually be attributed as a factor that caused the autoimmunity, and usually there is a story behind that, okay? So yes, ongoing stress is something to consider, okay? And having that resolved is very important. Sometimes you actually need the help of a psychologist, of a therapist, or someone that can actually help them, with that, okay? So having that said, now one of the things I wanted to talk about now is that all of these things, all of these contributing factors end up inducing what we know as molecular mimicry, okay, which means any foreign object, any foreign protein, any foreign toxin, any foreign, lipopolysaccharide, mycotoxin, a bacterial toxin, whatever, that enters the body, it's going to interact with your immune system, and your immune system is going to say, okay, I don't recognize you, I don't know who you are, so they start making antibodies. And unfortunately, these proteins, these foreign proteins that are entering your body because there's an increase in the permeability at the level of the gut, when you actually look at the molecular structure, they sometimes resemble endogenous proteins that you have in your own body. So now, let's say for instance, gliadin, if you look at the molecular structure of gliadin has an amino acid sequence that resembles many different proteins that are part of our own body. And this is where unfortunately, your body now starts overreacting and looking at proteins that might look similar to gliadin or, whatever foreign protein, and now says, hey, you know what, you kind of look like this guy, this bad dude, so I'm going to attack you anyways. And that's how you can develop a Hashimoto's disease, a lupus, psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, vitiligo, you name it, okay? Okay, I mainly deal with all types of all forms of autoimmunities, but since I'm a dermatologist, I see a lot of skin issues, okay? So molecular mimicry is a mechanism by which autoimmunity sets in, all right? Okay, and having that said, that's the mechanism by which every single patient, at least that I see, ends up having an autoimmune disease because it's part of the process. And this leads, obviously, once you have this autoimmune disease in place, it's because there has been ongoing chronic infection, dysbiosis, biofilms, presence of biofilms, obesity might be in the middle of there sometimes, you might have these genetic polymorphisms, you might be having this exposure to heavy metals, you might have these exposure to toxins, you might have been vaccinated, you might have ongoing stress, it all leads to chronic inflammation. And the more this inflammation is ongoing, the more autoimmunity it's going to express and more complications are going to show down the road, and as we know, for instance, lupus, the more you suffer from this condition, the more harm you're going to be getting from it, which can affect, kidneys, the heart, etc., etc. And psoriasis, the same thing, And yes, and even if this chronic inflammation is so chronic, it's been ongoing for such a long time, it could actually end up becoming something more severe, like cancer. Okay, so now here's another thing that I also mentioned here. I've drawn, as you can see, I drew these little mitochondria over here. You see, This is my mitochondria, by the way. So mitochondria are extremely important by the production of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is basically our energy, energy source for every single cell. So our cells, when they are in a state of chronic inflammation, there's also a low energy state, and this leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. Okay, so mitochondria are also compromised, and this is one of the reasons why whenever you have a patient who has autoimmune disease, you need to not only change the diet, treat the infection, treat the biofilms, make them go on a specific diet to lose weight, compensate those genetic polymorphisms, try to do some chelation perhaps to be able to eliminate those heavy metals, but also you need to give the mitochondria a supplement that helps the electron transport chain in order for those mitochondria to be able to produce adequate levels of ATP. Okay, now ATP, just to give you an example, sometimes I have patients, for instance, who have genetic polymorphisms on their magnesium genes. Okay, TPR1, for instance, and if you have this genetic polymorphism, you need higher doses of magnesium. You require 2 times or 3 times more magnesium than a normal individual. And if you do not have magnesium in adequate amounts, you can't transport ATP. So that patient ends up having a low energy state. Just to give you an example, so magnesium is so important for ATP production. Can you see? That's how important it is. So it's important to address all of these contributing factors whenever you see a patient. It's not that simple. It's not just compensating, giving them a high dose of vitamin D and putting them on an anti-inflammatory. You need to address every single one of these things. Okay? All right? And then finally, here's a concept that I have described in the medical literature. It's called vitamin D receptor cleansing through anti-inflammatory diet. See, this is a very important, very important concept. And I'm going to finish off with this real quick, okay? So, as I said, every single cell in your body has vitamin D receptors. And every single immune cell has vitamin D receptors. And if you have ongoing permeability that's coming from the gut, for instance, and it's allowing, for all these bacterial toxins, it's allowing for all these mycotoxins, it's allowing for all these lipopolysaccharides to come in. And all of these things are entering the bloodstream, and they have a very high affinity for vitamin D receptors. So if there is a very high affinity for vitamin D receptors, what happens is that they actually bind to these receptors and they block these receptors, and they don't allow now for the metabolite, a vitamin D metabolite, the actual hormone, the actual calcitrol, to be able to bind to these receptors to be able to do what they're doing, what they were supposed to do in the first place, which is activate, the vitamin D receptor, enhance transcription, make enzymes, proteins, or whatever the cell needs to do. So if you have ongoing leaky gut syndrome, ongoing entry of all these lipopolysaccharides, toxins, mycotoxins, etc., they are blocking your vitamin D receptors, and these vitamin D receptors now cannot function adequately. So if we change the diet, if we treat the infection, if we treat those biofilms, if we change the diet in order for the patient to lose some weight, if we compensate these genetic polymorphisms, if we eliminate all these heavy toxins and metals or whatever, and you increase, for instance, the energy state, what happens is that the leaky gut syndrome, the increased permeability of the gut, in a lapse of approximately 90 to 100 days, you change that enterocyte lining, that epithelial lining that you have in the gut, which basically reduces, significantly the amount of entry of all of these foreign proteins, lipopolysaccharides, toxins, mycotoxins. And by doing this, you reduce the amount of toxins that are circulating in the body, and with time, these vitamin D receptors will be downregulated, brand new ones will be upregulated, and now these receptors are going to be nice and clean, free to be able to interact with its active metabolite, known as a calcitrol. And then that's when the healing process starts to show, you see? So the vitamin D cleansing through anti-inflammatory diet is a very important concept that must be recognized by doctors and physicians. And this is the mechanism by which many times I see, that patients that are only just doing, going per protocol, and they're not changing their diet how they're supposed to be doing it, they're not doing all of these changes that are necessary, and they don't get better, it's because they haven't treated the cause. You see, you need to change the diet. Diet is so important, okay? So vitamin D cleansing through anti-inflammatory diet is a concept that I have described, and it's part of it is something that's described in my protocol, which is known as the leaky gut syndrome protocol, and it has helped many patients. Sometimes patients may be stubborn, they can't wait because they're trying all these different things, and they might have, for instance, a biofilm, an active biofilm that has not been treated yet correctly. So It's not just compensating the genes. It's not just, inhibiting PTH. You can do all of those things and nothing happens. The patient's still sick. And the reason why is because we haven't changed the diet. We haven't addressed those biofilms. We haven't eliminated any chronic infection. We haven't treated the obesity problem. We haven't perhaps eliminated toxins or heavy metals, or even patient might have even an implant, or patient was vaccinated and we're still having a spike protein that's circulating around there causing all this harm. Now there are supplements that can help with these things, or you haven't treated the low energy state, you see, and we need to give them supplements that can increase the low energy state. All of these things are very important, must be addressed, and that's what the LGS protocol tries to do. Okay, all right, everybody. I hope that this video might be a little bit more, bringing a little bit more light into your day, and perhaps give you some more insight on things that might be ongoing with you. If you have an autoimmune disease, or if you know someone that does, please give it a like and share. Okay, it was great talking to you. I hope you guys have a blessed day, and spread the word. All right, you guys have a good one. See you. Bye bye. Thanks.